I'm the CEO for the Jamaica Environment Trust. Okay, let me skip slides. I've practiced this before and it worked, and now it's okay. For those who don't know who JET is, we are a membership or a not-for-profit, non-government environmental organization, and we were formed in 1991. So this is back over 30 years now. Our mission is to protect Jamaica's natural resources. We use education, advocacy, and the law to influence individual and organizational behavior, public policy, and practice. And we try our best to respond to issues impacting the environment and Jamaicans once we are aware of the concerns. Since 2003, we have been working on the environment and public health impacts of the bauxite-alumina industry in Jamaica. And as we carried out this work, we were struck by the lack of accessible and comprehensive information on the costs and the benefits to Jamaica of bauxite mining and processing. And so this was really the rationale behind the study Red Dirt, which is a multidisciplinary study of the industry that was done in collaboration with the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, which is one of JET's longstanding partners, and other contracted local experts. And the study interrogates 6 aspects of the bauxite alumina industry: its history, regulatory framework, impacts on public health, society, and the natural environment. And finally, its social costs or externalities. And if you are interested, it is available on our website at jamentrust.org. Sorry, I'm just moving this out of the way. All right, so today, I do plan to share with you some of the findings from this study, and this was published in 2020, but I'm also going to give you a brief history of the industry, including the regulatory framework and then some of the benefits of the industry, because we can't talk about the negatives without also mentioning some of the positives. And then I'm going to zero in on some of the main findings of the industry, which looks at the environmental and social impact of the industry. And then I want to just briefly touch on some of the actions taken by communities to protect themselves and the environment from the impacts of the industry. So I want to start here. This is a map of Jamaica, and we have this very important area highlighted in red. And it is a well-known place located in our west central interior, and it's called Cockpit Country. It is Jamaica's largest remaining natural forest, and it is a repository for extraordinary biological diversity, a sanctuary for endangered species, and sits over a large aquifer which stores and releases fresh water via almost 40 rivers, streams, springs, upwellings, glades, and ponds. And it has been estimated that it supplies over 40% of Jamaica's Western freshwater needs. And it is also of cultural and historical significance for Jamaicans, as it is a place where the Windward Maroons fought the British to a treaty in 1739. In 2006, a prospecting license was granted to Alcoa, and this covered a large area of Cockpit Country. And it is around this time that JET became involved, and it's often why we say that the study Red Dirt had its origins in its concern for Cockpit Country. But I want to just say here that since 1950s, many groups had been trying to get Cockpit Country protected, but the issue was the boundary. What was the boundary to be? And so what I have here on this image, it shows the boundary that was originally proposed by the Cockpit Country. No, I wouldn't say originally proposed. It's proposed from around in 2006 by the Cockpit Country stakeholder group. It's one of the largest boundaries, and it covers over 110,000 hectares and included more than just the geology. I will say that it also had a lot of stakeholder consultations, and it was widely accepted by many that this should be what is considered Cockpit Country. So, and it included water resources and places of important cultural heritage, which is why we say that Cockpit Country is important, because it is water, it is people, it is history and culture, it is wildlife, and it supplies life-giving services for free. Important to note that after decades of advocacy by many environmental groups and individuals, this Cockpit Country protected area was gazetted. I think somebody's mic is open. Okay.
No longer.
All right, thanks. The Cockpit Country protected area was gazetted and closed to mining in March 2022. So that's just last year. It's smaller. You can see on this map, we have this yellow image here. It is smaller than what was proposed as the CCSG, that's the Cockpit Country Stakeholder Group Boundary. That's what you see in white. And what was actually agreed on by many stakeholders. And it does not include a buffer zone, which means that mining can take place literally, or any other activities can literally take place right up until the boundary. And the area is still under threat because of a special mining lease, SML 173, which is located in the northeast section, right adjacent to the boundary. And while it is not located in what has been gazetted as the Cockpit Country protected area, it's adjacent to the boundary, but still within the larger boundary, the larger white boundary that you see on this map. And it has the same characteristics as the area, as other areas found within the Cockpit Country, and is within an important watershed. It's not changing. Okay, so let's look at the early industry. Jamaica's bauxite-alumina industry had its beginnings in the early 1940s when Sir Alfred de Costa, who was a farmer and a businessman, found bauxite within his soils within his St. Anne property, the soils of his St. Anne property. And since then, bauxite deposits have been found in several parishes. Now, Jamaican bauxite is very different from other locations. It's very fine-grained. And so a new technology had to be developed to process this bauxite into alumina. And the deposits, how they are mined is that a thin layer of topsoil from the underlying deposits are removed, and then they excavate the fine particle-sized bauxite down to the limestones that define these mining pits. And the mining is then transported to processing areas by trucks or by conveyors or aerial ropeways. And the technology for processing bauxite to alumina is a bare process. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole details of that, but in simple terms, it involves heating under pressure in caustic soda to dissolve alumina minerals. And any plant that the bare process plants, they have to have their own power generation and wastewater treatment plants. And all of these mining and processing operations have the potential to pollute the environment. And then bauxite mining, after it was discovered in the 40s, it really began in earnest in the 1950s, but the first shipment of bauxite left Jamaica in 1952. The map, unfortunately, is a little blurry, but you can see that where most of the bauxite deposits are located. That's the hatch or the shaded areas. And you can see that many of these deposits are also located in Cockpit Country. And so, which is why it was so important for many of us to get involved in protecting Cockpit Country. Otherwise, we potentially would have mined this very important area. Now, in 1957, Jamaica was now the leading, in such a short space of time, we became the leading bauxite producer in the world. And the industry had now grown and expanded again in the 60s with growing demand for alumina. And so by 1974, we were not the leading, but we were the second largest producer of bauxite, and then the second largest exporter of alumina in the world. And up until 2001, the industry was controlled primarily by the four original players, or was controlled by the four original players, who were Alcan, Reynolds, Kaiser, and Alcoa. But since then, the industry has gone through a number of significant ownership or changes, both in terms of ownership of the companies and that relationship with the government of Jamaica. And today, we still have 4 mining companies or mining and processing companies, but they're not the same original ones. We have them now called Jamalco, Windalco, Gisco, and Discovery Bauxite Partners, formerly known as Noranda Bauxite Partners too. And as of 2022, Jamaica was the 10th largest producer of bauxite. And in terms of that relationship with the GOJ, I wanted to just add that, for example, Discovery Bauxite Partners, the GOJ owns about 51%, and Jamalco owns government owns about 45%. All right, it's important to give you this little bit of context before we mosey into to look at some of these impacts. So I briefly want to talk about the legal and regulatory framework. And it is governed, the industry itself is governed by quite a few laws and regulations. And I have included a few on this slide. These are the main ones on this slide, but I have another slide that I'll show you. And regulated by several organizations, as you can see here. And it was not until 2015 that the regulatory framework was generally considered adequate. It still has issues, but it was generally considered adequate. But despite this, there are several issues with monetary enforcement, and I'm going to try and reference some of those a little later down. And here again are some of the other regulations and laws that I mentioned, and you can see that it's quite extensive. And so you may understand the challenge in terms of regulating and monitoring these things, because when you have too many cooks in Jamaica, we say too many cooks spoil the broth. All right, so of course we have to mention the benefits, or else we would not be considered balanced in our discussions. But it's difficult. It has been difficult. And while we were doing this study, it's difficult to really properly understand the benefits of the industry, because the data or accessing the data has been a challenge. And the benefits, they can look very different depending on where your source is. I mean, recently, there's been a lot of discussion in the news because of a constitutional court case, and the judge has allowed for or granted an injunction. And there have been a lot of the supporters of the industry have been stating things like, the industry, Jamaica's economy cannot do without the industry. But it is, in terms of the conflicting reports, it's, your source of your data, what we have seen in terms of what we've been able to access tells a slightly different story. So we see that the industry generates about 1.5% of Jamaica's gross domestic product. We also see that with retained inflows, the industry represented 6% of total exports and 3% of total foreign exchange inflows. And in terms of employment, it in 2022 employed less than 0.4% of the employed labor force. And just for comparison, the agricultural industry in Jamaica, the sector in Jamaica, contributes around 8% to the GDP and employs about 14%. So we can see that there's a difference in interpretation of just how when we hear about how important the industry is to Jamaica's economy, it depends on your source of information. And what we are seeing is that it's not that critical as we're being told. It does make a contribution, but it is not as critical. In terms of the social benefits, the industry has pointed to benefits that they have provided to affected communities. So we've heard about things like scholarships, support for schools and community centers and greenhouses, but of course, at what costs? Because when we hear about these benefits, it has been done with the clear implication that these benefits outweigh the health costs and deterioration in rural community life. All right, so giving you a bit of context, I'm going to zero in on main findings of Red Dirt. Now, a lot of this information I've just presented is also included in Red Dirt as context. There are chapters, as I said, we spoke about the regulatory framework and the early beginnings, and it's all there if you want to get into more detail. So let's look at some of the main findings of Red Dirt. So this is just one slide that I've put up that kind of summarizes the negative impacts of the industry. And I've tried to separate them into mining and refining, because sometimes people don't make the distinction, but they are very different. And in terms of their impacts can also be different. So we can see here that in terms of bauxite mining, we speak about deforestation, ecological degradation, impacts on dust affecting air quality and water quality, in terms of the soil quality, which compromises food security. We look at relocation and loss of livelihoods. These are some other impacts, and I'm not saying these are exhaustive with but some have been kind of included in merged into each other. Bauxite refining, we look at air pollution also from generation. We look at water pollution, for example, if you have discharges of that effluent, which we have seen, and I'll make reference to, into waterways, ecological degradation again, and impacts on livelihoods. All right, so let's look at, I've highlighted a couple of the findings. And so one of the first findings is on the regulatory shortcoming. And here we just put it very briefly. There's a lack of transparency, despite the fact that we have an Access to Information Act. During the course of our study, JET has made multiple ATI requests with regards to this industry. Even now, we make multiple ATI requests. We've not always been given this information, and sometimes no explanation has been provided as to why we are not being provided the information. The Jamaica Bauxite Institute, which I had mentioned in an earlier slide, which is there to kind of oversee the industry, it really, when you examine how it operates, it's more of a pro-industry agency, and has, in our opinion, failed to carry out its environmental regulatory function. And we highlight here this conflict of interest. The regulatory framework has been long delayed up until 2015. And remember, this industry is around since the 1940s. It was inadequate for this entire period, but we still see that there are monitoring and enforcement failures. And then again, there are important data gaps. We see entirely insufficient efforts have been made to collect or analyze data. And several of these failures can be seen with the case of Rio Cobre. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this. For years, this river, there is a bauxite processing facility that is located adjacent to this river, and they have a effluent holding pond, which is where their liquor, what you call the liquor from the discharge from the Bayer process, which is highly alkaline, is stored. They do not have a permit to discharge this liquor, but they are allowed to discharge it in heavy rainfall and without a permit. There's like an understanding because of a dilution effect. Now, the river, importantly, supports fishers, water for agriculture, industry, and farming. And yet still, it has been repeatedly discharged or repeatedly impacted by illegal discharged effluents. We look at cases from 2011, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022 most recently, and they have received from the regulatory bodies, they've received enforcement notices, some breach notices. We've heard last year they were given a suspension notice, a notice of intention to suspend their permit. This was not done, though. It was just a notice that it would be suspended, and they're actually in court. But of course, how they will be fined, the NRCA Act, the fine goes up to 50,000 Jamaican dollars, which I'm not sure what the exchange rate is, but it's very minuscule. And then under the Wildlife Protection Act, it's up to 100,000 Jamaican dollars, which is very inadequate. And yet still they're allowed to continue to operate despite these regular issues. All right. The other finding is unequal sacrifices. What is this? Well, there have been persistent public health concerns, and unfortunately, they have been discounted by industry and government of Jamaica. There's only been one health impact study, despite the multiple complaints by the community. And I have an image up here. This is of a mud lake with that dust, which is the dried caustic fluid. And so that turns into dust. And when that goes on roofs, that it damages roofs, it damages plants. Of course, you breathe that in. All of this has, then this is just the processing. We also talk about the impacts from the dust in relation to the mining, because of course our law allows mining up to, I think it is 300 meters. So it's not a lot. Or is it? Yeah, it's not a lot of, the distance is not great. And so people are affected significantly by this dust, but no study has ever been done. Jamaica's air quality standards are outdated. So we are and insufficient to protect public health. So this major pollutants, what we call PM 2.5, which is the smallest particle size, which is generated by the industry, is not even monitored. And so oftentimes we have heard persons say that their complaints have been discounted because the industry, the companies are saying, oh, they just want some money. They just want some compensation money, because that is something that is given to some persons that are affected by dust. They're given a small compensation. It's called compensation, but it's a small payment per household every 3 months, depending on the company that you're looking at. But we can see that the study, we estimated that the health costs, just looking at 3 pollutants alone, cost anywhere between 2.9 billion and 13 billion. So it is significant. The industry has resulted in displacement and disruption, not only but to rural lives, to community, to farming and livelihoods. And reclamation standards, there is a requirement to reclaim these bauxite pits, but they are ineffective at restoring soil fertility for most crops, because what they're required to put back in terms of the thickness of the soil is much less than what was there before. So it cannot sustain any significant crops with deep roots. And the many of the farmers complain of the yield not being the same. And the direct benefits to communities were valued, but the costs and benefits not equal. They're not equal. And actually we see that the costs, they tend not to quantify them. So we only hear about the benefits of the industry, but we don't generally hear anybody talking about the costs of the industry. Okay, the other finding looks at the abuse of the ecological heritage. Bauxite mining has damaged ecosystems and ecological processes. Particularly, we have concerns for forests and soils. Less than, from what the data we were able to get, less than 0.5% have been rehabilitated to forest designations, right? This image here is an example of what a pit looks like. Jamaica's forests, they provide ecosystem services of approximately $52 million per annum in perpetuity. And we really couldn't verify. We've heard that, in terms of the reclamation claims, JBI has made certain claims about reclamations, but it's difficult to quantify or verify, because again, accessing this data was challenging. And we've been told that the industry has not resulted in damage to underground water, but the data is insufficient to support these claims. So there's a big gap in that data, but they've used this gap to say that there has been no damage. And of course, no data doesn't mean that there's no damage. It just means that there's no data to be able to say this. But we've been hearing that there's been no damage done to our underground water. The other finding here is that costs exceed benefits. This is an example in this image of what reclamation looks like. So mining takes place all the way down to the limestone, which is that white material that you see. And then the soil is being, the topsoil that was originally taken off to then extract the bauxite is being added back so that the land can be used again for farming, as most of these areas are farming lands. So the early days of bauxite did bring benefits, and we're not contesting that. But and we see that the inflows, some of these benefits looked at the inflows by the bauxite levy, which we still see today, although it's significantly less. We have higher wages and benefits for bauxite wage workers. There were collective bargaining processes established, and there was the emergence of community councils. Now, but the social costs of the industry far exceeded the benefits. And if we look at the two categories of social costs, that's public health and carbon, we see that the costs exceed benefits by a wide range. We look at 2.9 billion to 18 billion per annum as the cost. And remember, we heard earlier that, well, I spoke to you about the percentage, but in terms of the actual value, it has been estimated at $1 billion in contribution to our economy. So you can see that the costs do exceed the benefits. I want to add here that from as early as the 1940s, Jamaican farmers have been signing petitions. They wrote letters to newspapers, they held community meetings to discuss and contest the effects of bauxite mining on their community. Because the rise and expansion of the industry displaced alternative ways of engaging with the land. And although the bauxite communities had frequently documented and publicized their agricultural initiatives, their resettlement programs, their land rehabilitation efforts, the industry never acknowledged the pressure from rural communities that had produced these compromises. Okay, so now that I've taken you through some of the main findings, and there are many other findings, but we've tried to zero in on some of the main ones. I want to look at some of the actions that have been taken to protect the environment and communities. And these are just a few. This is not a lot. Now I want to start here with this graphic. This was produced by Freedom Imaginaries. And it illustrates that how the impacts of the industry coupled with a weak regulatory framework can result in the violation of human rights. And over the 70-year history of the industry, we see many examples of this. So you can see that when you have weak oversight, no access to participation, inaccessible remedies, combine that with some of the impacts of the industry in terms of air, noise, and noise pollution and water contamination that causes illnesses and loss of livelihood, and other human rights violation, and the cycle continues. All Jamaicans have a constitutional right to enjoy a healthy and productive environment, free from the threats of injury or damage from environmental abuse and degradation of the ecological heritage. And it is quite interesting that, I mean, we've mentioned this many times, and there's so many people that do not know this, and so have taken to simply accepting some of the negative impacts because they thought that they had there was nothing else, no other alternative. A healthy environment that we see here, is clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, we see a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, a non-toxic environment in which people can live, work, study, and play. So this is what we've defined, or has been defined as a healthy environment. And what we've seen is that, as I said, this has been since 2011, and coming out of this understanding, we've seen certain actions taken by the communities. Firstly, we have the Safe Cockpit Country campaign, which began in 2006. JET was a part of that, along with several other both individuals and organizations like Windsor Research Center. We had STAIR and several other people that were involved. And through the successes, and we could talk a lot about the Safe Cockpit Country campaign, but a lot of this is before my time. And so I've only zeroed in on a few of these things. We have one of the outcomes is that the Cockpit Country protected area, as I mentioned, was legally protected and closed to mining in March 2022. And the area is 30% smaller than what was proposed, unfortunately. But we do have a significant, it is the largest terrestrial area, protected area. And so that is progress. That is something significant, despite the fact that it's not exactly what we wanted. And then we see that an environmental permit for SML 173, while it was granted, the area was significantly reduced, moving from a roughly 6,000 hectares to about 1,333 hectares, but no buffer zone was included. So while these are not what we would have wanted, it did the efforts, the advocacy efforts of the individuals and the persons involved, it did yield some amount of success. And then when we look at the two constitutional court cases, which are before the courts now, in the matter of special mining leases permitting bauxite mining in areas where the claimants live and farm, we see that an injunction has been granted until the final determination of the claim. And then in terms of the Southern Trelawney Agency, STEA, and the farmer Clifton Barton, that case, that has focused on the proposed mining in sections of St. Anne and Trelawney. They were trying to dismiss the case, and we've seen that the court has ruled that they can be considered a person, and so it has not been thrown. The case has not been thrown out. Again, we also have this most recent fish kill in the Rio Cobre, another constitutional case. While it's not filed, it is being contemplated by the community, because this is it's a repeat issue. Unfortunately, when the fishers were provided with the compensation, or with the it's called compensation, following the drawdown of the environmental performance bond, they were required to sign release and discharge forms, which basically said that we will not pursue any legal action against any government organization once I receive these forms in relation to this case. But I know that it is still something that is being contemplated. And these are important actions, and we have seen that sometimes the legal route is oftentimes the only route that is taken more seriously by the government. There are other precautionary measures have been filed with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the government has been given, and this was from, I think it was late last year, they were required to submit a response. I don't know if they've submitted a response as yet, but we've seen that communities, persons being impacted, are taking action because they are frustrated with personally just being ignored, and that they believe that in many of these cases, or many of these instances, their constitutional rights are being violated. And then I wanted to just, as I end my talk, the conclusions and recommendations from the study. Now, these summary conclusions, they were compiled by JET, but they were not necessarily, and so they were not necessarily the conclusion of the authors that were involved, but they were pulled from their findings. In terms of, we pulled out some of the priorities, right? And we felt that it was very important that you conduct a study of the costs and benefits, including the cumulative impacts. Because we talk about, as I mentioned, we talk about the benefits a lot, but we have not spent much time talking about the costs. And for us to truly understand the significance of an economy, or not an economy, of an industry, or to even contemplate if it's so important, we should understand if its costs exceed the benefits. And from our preliminary estimations, we have seen that. Again, one of the challenges that this might pose is that accessing the data would be difficult, because we're not as free with the data as it relates to the industry. We believe that proactively, the government should proactively disclose all public documents, mining leases and permits, air quality, water air and water quality data, level and sources of emissions, and monitoring plans. Unfortunately, yes, while you can get access to some of this, you do have to make an ATI request, which takes about 30 days if they don't delay. And of course, your wording for the ATI request is important, and you don't necessarily get everything. We've done this, we've made the ATI request and you don't get all the data. We believe that we need to return environmental oversight to NEPA, that's the National Environment and Planning Agency, because currently there is an MOU between NEPA and the Jamaica Bauxite Institute. And we need to improve the monitoring and enforcement, because we've seen that the Jamaica Bauxite Institute, while they are responsible for monitoring the environmental oversight of the industry, we have seen some of their reports that they have submitted to NEPA, their environmental monitoring reports that they have submitted to NEPA. And it's lacking. It's significantly lacking. And it would be difficult for one to take that information and to properly make a decision. So we think that there should be a return to NEPA to have that environmental oversight, especially because we've seen that conflict of interest between JBI and the industry, because they're there to promote the industry. And we have also said, we also think that we also recommended that a study comparing the economic, social, and public health of rural communities affected by proximity to mining processing with those which are not in versus processing with those which are not in close proximity be done. My final slide, in terms of recommendation, well, it's my final slide. Revised reclamation requirements. You've heard me mention that farmers have indicated that the reclamation, the soils that have been reclaimed are just not adequate, not good enough. And so we believe that the reclamation requirements should immediately be revised to include ecological functions, because it doesn't specifically state this. And we think that it's important to reactivate the National Restoration Committee, provide the necessary GIS, that's the Geographical Information Systems information, to researchers, so that the status of pit reclamation can be independently assessed. You heard me mention that we've heard, that how many pits may have been reclaimed, but it's been difficult to verify that information. Ensure that adequate performance bonds are put in place at outset to restore any damage. The performance bond that was put in place for the Windalco in relation to recover was 115 million Jamaican dollars, which was about 776,000 US, depending on my roughly 770,000 US dollars. And the value of the damage was over $200 million. And so if the bond was for 115 and the value of the damage is over 215, we have, according to the statement from the ministry, we were told that the government of Jamaica is going to have to find the rest of those funds, which means that essentially the government of Jamaica, us, the taxpayers, are paying for the damage done by the industry. We also think it is important, my final point, to institute continuous health monitoring, including baseline data for the life of any mining lease. Currently, in terms of, for example, air quality, it's not continuous. And of course, the way how the law is written, the proof of the burden is on the persons that have been impacted, and several of these persons from the rural community, they don't keep receipts, they don't keep all of these different information that would be useful in terms of proving that their health has been impacted. So it is a challenge. Okay, and again, you can find the full study on jamentrust.org on our website in the publications folder. And thank you very much. I will stop sharing now and hand over back to Steve.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very, I was going to say interesting. I wish it wasn't so interesting, if you see what I mean. Yeah, so now we're open to questions to Theresa. Would you put your you can use the raise your hand function of the from the bottom of the screen, and I'll invite you to do that if anyone wishes to say anything. While you're contemplating that, it was very comprehensive in my view. What interested me, or interested again, perhaps the wrong word, is that if the reclamation is being done so badly, if you will, while these companies are still there, one wonders what happens when they go, because there's a long history of extractive industries taking what they want, all over the world, and taking what they want, leaving a mess, and then disappearing and leaving the local people to clear up the mess after them. So how does that fit into your view of what's going on?
Sorry. This is something that we're looking at in terms of they're required to post bonds. The law requires them to post bonds in case of no rehabilitation takes place. And we tried to get this information very recently as well, in terms of what percentage of these companies have posted the bonds, and what percentage has Mines and Geology or Jamaica Bauxite Institute have had to draw down on the bonds to actually execute the rehabilitation themselves. And we were not able to get this information. It's what we have learned is that some of these companies leave the pits open, or leave them considered open, so that they don't have to undergo reclamation. Because as soon as you declare them closed, meaning they're no longer any resources to extract, then rehabilitation has to take place within 3 years. So that's one of the other things that we have learned that is done. But we have been, as you can see, the study is out since 2020. We've, made these recommendations, but we don't get a lot of dialogue, feedback from the government. When we gave them this report for their feedback, nobody engaged with us. We may have gotten a letter that said, thank you, we'll give you our comments, we'll give you some comments, and that was it. But we gave them the opportunity to give us the information to explain certain things, and this was not done.
Yes, right. I see we have a couple of questions in the chat. One from Paul Ward. Paul, do you want to speak yourself, or do you want me to read it?
I can speak, perhaps. Perhaps I should make life easier. Hi, Theresa. Thank you for being here very much. The question I asked you, actually, but maybe you can repeat the answer if you like. Jamaica Environmental Trust, of which you're the leading light, doesn't it argue for immediate closure of the bauxite-alumina industry, but it does argue for an exit strategy, which I perhaps could call a just transition out of the industry, with a time-defined period. Do you know if any work has been done on anything like that?
No, but yes, you're right. We have been saying that we've been hearing that the industry has only a certain amount of available resources left to extract, and if they, according to if you listen to the different supporters of the industry, if it is so important to the economy and it will have such a negative impact if you close it down, then we think that rather than wait, and depending on your sources, you will see 100 years, which I think is at the very upper limit of it, but it's really between 30 and 50, because while there are resources, while there are reserves, not all of them can actually be mined. So in terms of between 30 and 50 years, if we think it's very important that a suitable replacement or suitable alternative be considered at this point, or start to consider rather than wait until it's too late, because we do sometimes have a habit of that, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. There's a question from Jean Besson. She says, thanks for a very informative talk. How do the boundaries of the Cockpit Country for mining affect the Leeward Maroons Treaty land boundaries and the Akampong Maroons at this time?
I'm just looking at it, the boundaries of the Cockpit Country for mining. The Cockpit Country protected area, I think it includes all of the maroon, or some, I'm not sure if it's all, but it's supposed to close. It's not just it's a protected area that says it is also close to mining. So as far as I understand it, in terms of the boundaries, it doesn't negatively impact the maroons. But what has been called for is that the boundary is still too small, as you heard me mention, and it should have been wider. The area should have been wider, because Cockpit Country is more than what has been proposed in that small roughly 74,000 hectare boundary called the Cockpit Country protected area.
I see a hand from Lennon J. Do you want to unmute and
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, can.
Excellent. A question for you, Theresa. I'm puzzled here because I've sent you on numerous times information regarding the earnings from bauxite, because I don't understand when you say these benefits. I live in Jamaica and I can't see these benefits. Now, in the last 5 years, now between 2017 and 2021, bauxite earned 3.684 billion US, and yet the Jamaican government or the Treasury only received 18.4 million from that. That is a 0.5% taxation rate. So surely, if we're going to look at mining, surely that's all we need to do is look at the benefit, and the benefit that we can see is only 18 million, and yet the earnings are nearly 3.7 billion. And yet for some reason, I don't understand why JET doesn't investigate the sole reason for mining. Mining is done for money, no other reason. And yet Jamaica makes absolutely no money from mining.
Sorry, there's a feedback. I don't know where the feedback is. Okay, I'll just go ahead. Yes, we got your data. Obviously, this is after the publication was put out. But of course, remember I said in terms of the benefits, these are the benefits that the industry has claimed as well. And one of the things I did say in terms of prefacing it is that the data that has been used, or the data to support the findings was very difficult to access. And in terms of the recommendations, we did highlight that it is important to do a cost benefit analysis, because while, as you say, you can document and you put forward some of the figures, and we also had included some of the figures, while you see the costs, while you see the economic benefits as proposed in terms of contribution to our GDP and so forth, the costs have not been quantified. And so this is something that we've been asking for. JET ourselves, we have actually tried to explore getting this done, but it's been a bit challenging in terms of finding the interested or the experts that are willing to undertake this study.
Right, thanks.
Can I
thanks
comment
very
on
much.
that? Can I comment on that, please, Steve?
Very briefly, yes.
No, Theresa. The benefits can be found, and the benefit, as I said, over the last 5 years was 18.5 million. Now, when you really look around and we talk about the displacement of people, the poisoning of the Rio Cobre, the poisoning of the environment, the impact on people's health, that far outweighs 18.4 million. So it really is straightforward, surely. I don't understand what
I'm not
you're making here about the benefits.
I'm not arguing with you. I'm saying that while we need to quantify those same costs, those costs that you've just listed out, we have to quantify them, and getting the data to support some of those costs has also been a challenge, but we did do some quantification, which is why we have put a range in terms of the costs range of the industry going from about 2.9 to $18 billion. And we have said that as far as we understand it, the costs of the industry far exceeds the benefits of the industry.
Yeah, I think you made that quite clear. Thank you. Right, we have a in the chat. There's Shadonna has posted a list to a documentary made by a link to a documentary made by Vice, which some of us have seen, and which is actually very important and very informative about the Akampong Maroons. Carol Vincent.
It has two parts to that documentary, just to add.
Right. Yes. So that's I've seen that. That's well worth looking at. Carol Vincent draws our attention to the April the 21st and 24th protests in London about the environment, and I think she's right that we need to take an international view of the problems of the environment, and this is one thing that we can raise, and that people who are involved in that can raise. Right, I see two questions. Firstly, Gad.
Yes, thanks, Theresa. That was really interesting. Thanks very much. I want to pursue this question of costs and benefits, and particularly perception, because I think you did extremely well in discussing the high costs of the industry and the relatively small benefits. But I'm wondering, in my perception of Jamaicans viewing this is not that. What do you think the public perception in Jamaica of the costs and benefits are?
Well, I think that the perception is changing. I think that the conversation that we generally hear is, even in relation to this recent constitutional case, has just been, oh my goodness, what are we going to do without the bauxite industry? And has only focused on the economic importance, or the benefits of the industry. And yet still we are seeing repeatedly, the problem is that we don't really quantify environment. We don't quantify environmental assets, and we're not in the habit, rather, of quantifying natural assets. And so that cost, that benefit that comes with having a healthy environment, a healthy river, is not quantified. And so you're given one side of the story, which is the one that is quantified, which is how much jobs are produced or generated and how much money is put forward in the GDP. And we tried to do that by putting forward that if you just cost certain things, and we weren't able to cost everything. If you cost everything in terms of the climate, the environment, what we could put a figure to, the contribution to climate change or the benefits there, it showed us that just looking at some very you know, in these numbers in a very general sense, there was up to $18 billion in costs, right? So I think, to answer your question, I think the perception is changing, especially after we had a recent massive fish kill in the Rio Cobre. And we see that a lot of outrage, there was a lot of outrage by persons, not only nearby the community that are typically would be said to benefit in some way from the industry in terms of a family member works in the industry or whatever. But, you know, this outrage that these things are happening over and over again, and there doesn't seem to be enough of a consequence to the industries. So I think the perception is changing.
High time, perhaps, huh? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kate?
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. I was really interested that you mentioned the constitutional right in the preamble, the constitutional right to enjoy a healthy and productive environment. And I wondered whether there's any sort of coordinated advocacy or any coordinated strategy among advocates to, you know, beyond the 2 legal cases that you mentioned that are ongoing, to make a constitutional challenge to the bauxite companies. You mentioned that the legal route was the only route that the government seemed to take seriously. I wondered, what are the other routes as well beyond sort of potential legal challenges, invoking the constitutional right to a healthy environment and an environment free from abuse and degradation? What are the other options, direct action, other forms of mobilization that people are engaging with?
There is a lot of advocacy. So JET, and I think there is Jamaicans for Justice is a human rights organization. They've also been going around. We have also been having discussions with some members of some rural communities in terms of that simple thing about, do you know your rights? Do you know you have a right to healthy environment? Because a lot, as I'd mentioned, a lot of people, and we're doing another study that's kind of a spin-off from Red Dirt, trying to understand certain issues in relation to compensation. And one of the things that we've learned is that many persons don't, because they don't have access to legal remedies or don't have the financial resources, don't even understand what their options are. They have been taken for a ride, let's put it that way, right? And so what the efforts have been focused on educating different communities and their leaders about the Constitution, the right to a healthy environment, what are some legal remedies. And in the case of Jamaicans for Justice, for example, they are trying to provide any kind of legal assistance in relation to, say, titling. So several persons, you know, in terms of displacement, they've been required to move. They've been displaced to other locations. They've been given property, but they have no titles. And of course, without a title, you know, that there are significant issues in that, you know, you can't use it, for example, to get a loan and so forth. So we've been trying in that route as well. But in terms of a coordinated efforts, that hasn't been contemplated at the moment. But I think we're trying to raise the awareness for sure in relation to your rights, to their rights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. Are there any other questions? I see that Sundo Thomas has asked, how effective are environmental, eco and health and safety wellbeing departments in Jamaica? And are the companies made accountable for the harm caused? Well, I think you've answered that quite well in the negative.
But I'll just say it again. Not very effective at all. We have seen that we have regulations, as I mentioned, that it's up, you know, it's considered adequate in terms of the framework. There are issues, but it's useful enough as it is. but we don't see effective monitoring and enforcement. Case in point, again, remember I spoke about the rare cobra issue. It is the view of many, including JET, that if stronger action had been taken, if the penalties for illegally discharging into a river were higher, then we would see that there might, and if the enforcement of those laws and the monitoring of the data was better, it is unlikely that we would see such a repeat. Remember, I told you some back-to-back dates. We looked at 2019, 2020, 21, 2022, 2022 being the major fish kill. And just to point out here, this discharge, the major fish kill took place in July, August of last year. The fish have not come back in for commercial value. And so the fishers are still without a source of income. And I think that's very important to mention as well, because it's not just an immediate thing, it's about this long-term impact as well. And so while we do have these laws, I don't think that we're monitoring or enforcing them adequately. And we do, and actually in relation to the penalties, we were told, because, and it's something that we've been advocating for years, for increasing those penalties. We've been told that there will be increased shortly. I think the timeline for that is probably past or is coming up. So we see how that goes, if it's just one of those paper promises.
Thank you. Yes, there's Paul Ward has put a couple of comments in the chat. One about what attitude do trade unions in Jamaica take, given that the industry only employs such a relatively small number of people, and but has this caused tensions in the communities affected? Because obviously some people will be digging up their neighbour's land, if you will. So I wonder about that sort of those attitudes, because this really does go back to what Paul said earlier, it seems to me, about the so-called just transition strategy.
Yeah, I don't know in terms of the trade unions, in terms of and Paul, you may know better than me in terms of how they've responded to, but in terms of the community, you'd see that it's kind of divided. I'll give you an example of one of the communities that last year we spent a lot of time in. They don't want, actually, it's not just one, several other communities, they don't want, they would rather not have bauxite mining in their community. But if it had to happen, they wanted better compensation. So we kind of saw where there were, and I would say that I don't know how to divide it, but I felt that there was a divide between those that were pro, because it was all about money. And then there were a few that were, listen, I felt it firsthand. I've felt the negative impacts. I have had health issues. I've suffered. My children have suffered. I've spent a lot of time on medical issues. And I think we don't need this industry. So it's on both extremes, unfortunately. So yes, I think there is some amount of tension. Just depends on where you go, though.
Right. Thanks very much. I think that's we've worked Theresa hard enough now. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, in my view, that has really gone into and explained the situation in Jamaica and the problems that the industry is creating. I think that it's incumbent upon people in Britain to raise this issue with environmentalists in this country. My union branch has managed to raise it at last year's annual congress of the trade union. I think that there are ways that we can get the word out about this, if only to encourage those in Jamaica, like Theresa and others, who are trying to expose the dangers and the perils that are involved here. So, Theresa, do you want to sum up? Do you want to have it? Is there anything you want to say to finish us off? Sorry, that was a really wrong way of putting it. To finish an excellent session.
We are concerned with this push to expanding the extractive industry even further in Jamaica, despite the known impacts of the industry, the bauxite-alumina industry. And so we are calling for, this is why it is unlikely, it is highly unlikely that the industry will shut the doors of the industry. But it's important that we adjust, that we address the shortcomings, we address the regulatory framework, the issues there, the monitoring and enforcement. And I think critical to where we are now is to take strong, we want to encourage the government of Jamaica to take strong action in terms of looking at some of the issues of the industry and really addressing them in a very purposeful way, and not just making these empty statements on paper about what they will and will not do. So we will continue, and in relation to the Cockpit Country, we will continue to advocate for a buffer zone because it is smaller. What has been gazetted is smaller than what was proposed by many of the stakeholders. And so we will continue to advocate for these things. And I think I'd like to encourage those that are interested to continue to write, because if we don't keep these issues, and I mean write, not just to the agencies, but in a public way. I know Paul writes, and I know that John writes, and I think it's important that these continue to be put out there, because it's harder to ignore the government. It's harder to ignore those things. And so I encourage each of us depending on your strengths. My strengths are not numbers. Your strengths might be numbers. Definitely Paul's strength is numbers. So continue to write and put those things out there so that we can increase the awareness, and so that we can protect those vulnerable groups that are consistently being exposed to the impacts of the industry.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure there's a round of applause going around the room, even if silently. And it's very much appreciated. We have recorded the meeting, and that will be available. What I'll do is, once we've edited the recording and put it out there, I will email everyone who registered for this, because there are some people who registered and then later said they couldn't make it, so that will be available. And at the same time, I'll make the chat available, because there was some useful information in that, some links and so on, that people might find might wish to pursue the matter. So again, a big thank you to Theresa for an excellent talk. We're all wiser, if not happier, and so thank you very much. Before everyone goes, can I and I'm just going to if I may share my screen so that you can see the details of the next meeting in April. God, what am I saying? In April, where the 26th of April, Dave Dunkley will speak about women and Rastafari politics, and I will circulate the details of where you can register for that and so on in the normal manner. And we look forward to seeing many of you again. And so once again, thanks to Theresa. Keep up the good work, and we hope we can do at least a little in this country to spread the word of what you're saying. So bye everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.